The prison stood like a giant block of cold concrete beneath a sky that never seemed fully bright. Even during the day, the sunlight felt weak, as if it hesitated to come too close. Tall gray walls surrounded the prison, wrapped in sharp wires that shimmered faintly whenever light touched them. Inside, the air was heavy and dry, and every sound footsteps, clanging metal doors. Distant voices echoed through long, narrow corridors, making the place feel even emptier than it already was. In one of those cells lived an inmate who seemed like he did not belong anywhere. Everyone knew him, but not in a good way. Some called him stubborn, others dangerous, and most simply chose to stay away. He rarely spoke, never laughed, and showed no reaction to anything. His face remained calm, but not peaceful, more like a locked door no one could open. His eyes always looked distant, as if they were trapped in memories he wished he could forget. His cell was small and lifeless, with a metal bed pressed against the wall and covered by a thin, worn blanket. The small barred window allowed a little light inside, but it never felt like enough. Dust gathered untouched in the corners, and the air inside felt frozen, as though time itself had stopped. Every morning, he woke the same way, sitting quietly on the edge of his bed, staring at nothing. Not because there was nothing to see, but because facing the outside world felt harder than staring at an empty wall. There was something inside him, something broken and heavy, and he carried it everywhere. Whether he walked, sat, or closed his eyes, it never left him. At night, when the prison grew quieter and the noise faded into distant murmurs, something strange would happen. His hands would begin to move slightly, almost without his awareness. His fingers pressed softly against the air, as if they were touching invisible piano keys. The movement was gentle and emotional, but the moment he noticed it, a would stop, pulling his hands back and clenching them into fists, as if angry at himself for remembering something he believed should no longer exist. Days passed, like this, quiet, heavy, unchanged, but the prison around him was not the same. Tension had been building for weeks. It began with whispers between inmates, small arguments, and cold stares during meals. Slowly, it grew louder. Voices became sharper. Trays slammed harder, and even the guards seemed more alert. Something was wrong, and everyone could feel it. The air itself felt tight, as if it were holding its breath. The quiet inmate noticed it too, not with fear, but with awareness. He observed everything, every movement, every glance, every subtle sign that something bigger was coming. One afternoon, the sky darkened unusually, early as thick clouds swallowed the sun, making the already dull prison feel even more lifeless. In the dining hall, the atmosphere shifted strangely, starting to quiet before suddenly becoming too loud. Two inmates began arguing over something insignificant, though no one really knew what it was about. Their voices carried a deeper anger that had been waiting for too long. Others began watching, some leaning in, while others stepped back. The argument escalated quickly, voices rising, chairs scraping harshly, metal trays slamming. A guard tried to intervene, but his voice was swallowed by the growing noise. Then, in a single moment, something snapped. Like a thread stretched too far, the room erupted into chaos. Shouts replaced voices, panic replaced control, and movement became wild and unpredictable. The calm was gone entirely. Amid all these, the quiet inmate stood at the back of the room, still and observant. He did not shout or run like the others. His eyes moved slowly, taking in the fear, anger, and confusion around him. For a moment, it seemed he would walk away as he always did when things became overwhelming. But this time, something inside him shifted. While the chaos roared outside, a different sound began to rise within him, soft, slow, and familiar. At first, it was faint, almost unnoticeable, but gradually it became clearer. It was a melody. His fingers moved slightly, almost involuntarily, and his breathing changed. The chaos around him began to blur, fading into the background as the sound inside his mind grew stronger, deeper, more real. It was not just a memory, it was something he had once loved and lost. Slowly, he turned his head and looked down a long hallway. At the far end was a forgotten room, one most inmates ignored and guards barely remembered. It was old, dusty, and silent, but something inside it seemed to call him. Without rushing, he began to walk toward it, step by step, calm and steady, as if following a path only he could see. Around him, chaos continued, people shouting, pushing, running, but none of it seemed to touch him. It was as if he existed in a different world. With each step, the noise behind him faded, becoming less real, less important. All that remained was the melody guiding him forward. The hallway lights flickered above him, casting uneven shadows on the cold walls. The air felt colder, and distant alarms echoed faintly. When he reached the door, he noticed it was slightly open, as though it had been waiting for him. He paused, not out of doubt, but out of fear of what stepping inside might awaken. Memories he had buried, emotions he had locked away, a part of himself he had refused to face. Slowly, he lifted his hand and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dim and silent. Dust floated in the faint beam of light coming from a small window. The walls were worn, the floor aged, and in the center stood an old piano. It looked forgotten, its wood scratched and faded, its keys uneven and yellowed with time. Yet it still stood there, as if whitened. The inmate stepped inside, the door creaking softly behind him. For a moment, he did nothing but stare at it. Then, slowly, his expression began to change. The hardness in his face soft, the tension in his jaw eased, and his distant eyes filled with something deeper, something human, something vulnerable. He took a step closer, then another, each one heavier than the last, as though he were walking toward a lost part of himself. When he finally stood close enough, his hands lifted slightly, but froze midair, trembling not out of fear of the piano, but fear of what it represented. Outside, chaos still raged, but inside the room, there was only silence, deep, heavy, and peaceful. He closed his eyes briefly and took a slow breath, and in that breath, something inside him broke, not painfully, but honestly, as if he were finally allowing himself to feel again. His fingers moved closer to the keys, not touching them yet, just remembering, just feeling. And in that quiet moment, while the world outside fell apart, he stood on the edge of becoming someone he had long forgotten he could be. For a moment, everything remained still. His fingers hovered above the old, Giloate keys, trembling slightly now, out of weakness, but under the weight of everything he had tried to forget. The silence in the room felt deep, almost sacred, as if time itself had slowed to witness what he would do next. Outside, chaos still raged. Distant shouts echoed through the corridors. Heavy footsteps rushed past. Metal doors slammed violently, and alarms cried out without rest. The prison had lost control. Yet inside this small, forgotten room, there was only him and the piano. He opened his eyes slowly, and they were no longer empty. For the first time in a long while, they carried emotion, clear, raw, and real. Not anger, not fear, but something deeper, something undeniably human. He took a slow breath, and then his fingers gently touched the keys. The first note echoed softly into the air. It was quiet, almost fragile, but it was enough. He froze for a brief moment, as if surprised that the sound still existed, that he could still create it. Then, slowly and carefully, he pressed another key, and then another. A melody began to form, soft, slow, and familiar. Each note carried a fragment of something long buried within him. The piano was worn, its keys imperfect and slightly out of tune, but the emotion behind the sound was pure, and it filled the room completely. His hands began to move more freely now, not fast or rushed, but steady, like someone remembering how to breathe after holding it in for too long. The melody of Moonlight Sonata unfolded gently, flowing through the silence like a quiet river beneath a dark sky. Outside the room, something unexpected began to happen. At first, no one noticed. The chaos continued, voices still shouting, feet still running. But then one inmate passing by slowed down. He turned his head slightly, as if he had heard something that did not belong in the middle of all that noise. He stopped and listened. The sound reached him faintly, but clearly a piano. Confused, he stepped closer. Inside, the inmate continued playing, his face now completely soft. The anger that once defined him had disappeared, replaced by something calm and honest. His eyes followed his fingers across the keys, as though each note guided him deeper into himself. Memories began to return, not all painful. Some were warm and gentle. A quiet room from long ago, light streaming through a window, a soft voice offering encouragement. A time when life felt simple and music meant everything. His fingers moved with growing confidence, and the melody strengthened, becoming fuller and more alive. Outside, more people began to notice. Another inmate slowed, then another. The shouting near the hallway began to fade, not because the chaos had ended, but because attention had shifted. Curiosity replaced anger, and confusion replaced fear. Someone whispered, "What is that?" But no one answered, because no one needed to. They could hear it. They could feel it. Something soft was moving through a place that had long forgotten softness. Even a guard rushing down the corridor paused, his grip tightening for a moment before stilling. He listened, just for a second, and in that second, he didn't move. The music flowed through the prison like something alive, something powerful. Back in the room, the inmate was no longer aware of the outside world. Not the riot, not the alarms, not the danger. There was only the piano, the music, and the feeling it carried. His shoulders relaxed, his breathing slowed, and for the first time in years, he did not feel trapped, not by the prison, not by his past, not even by himself. The music gave him something he had lost. Freedom. Not the kind found beyond walls, but the kind that lives within a person. As the melody deepened, the atmosphere of the prison began to change. The noise started to settle, not completely, but enough. Shouting softened into murmurs, running slowed into stillness. People who moments before had been consumed by anger now stood quietly, listening. Some leaned against the walls, others remained motionless in the hallway. No one spoke loudly anymore. It was as if the music had gently placed a hand over the entire prison and asked it to breathe somehow. It listened. The guard, who had paused earlier, slowly lowered his shoulders. Another guard nearby glanced at him in confusion but said nothing, because even he could feel it. This was not control, not force. This was something deeper, something no rule or command could ever create. Inside the room, the inmate's fingers moved with quiet confidence. The broken piano no longer mattered. The worn keys no longer mattered. What he was playing was not just musiquette, was his truth, his pain, his memories, and his hope. All woven into each note. A single tear rolled slowly down his cheek, but he did not stop playing. He did not wipe it away. For the first time, he was not hiding. The melody approached its final movement, soft and gentle, like a farewell, or perhaps like a beginning. His fingers slowed, each note lighter and more delicate than the last. By now, the prison had grown almost completely silent. Dozens of inmates stood still. Guards remained motionless. No one gave orders. No one shouted. They simply listened, together. The final note echoed into the air, lingering for a moment before fading into silence real. Deep silence. His fingers rested on the keys briefly, then slowly lifted. He took a breath. A different kind of breath. Calm, steady, free. He looked at the piano one last time before lowering his hands. Outside the room, no one moved immediately, as if afraid to break what had just happened. Then slowly, very slowly, people began to step back, not in fear, but in quiet understanding. The riot was over, not because someone had forced it to stop, but because something had changed within the people themselves. The inmate stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked toward the door. He was not the same person who had entered. Something inside him had shifted. As he stepped into the hallway, people looked at him differently, not with fear or anger, but with respect. Silence followed him as he walked, and even the guards did not stop him. They simply watched, understanding that this was not just an inmate leaving a room, but someone who had found something rare and powerful. Later, he returned to his selva, same small space with the same metal bed and dim light. Yet it no longer felt the same, because he was no longer the same. He sat down slowly, looking at his hands, the same hands that once carried anger, now holding something softer and stronger. Leaning back against the wall, he closed his eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, there was peace. Not outside, but with an end that made all the difference.